The banquet hall shimmered with an ethereal glow, bathed in the soft light of floating crystal chandeliers. The grandeur of the event seemed almost surreal, like something out of a dream. In the heart of the massive hall, adorned with opulent decorations and grand tapestries, the most influential beings in the galaxy had gathered to celebrate a diplomatic triumph. Yet, amidst the sea of alien dignitaries and the elite of the Andromeda Empire, one figure felt entirely out of place. The human emissary stood at the edge of the room, a slight figure dwarfed by the grandeur surrounding him. His name was Marcus, a skilled diplomat from Earth, who had never imagined being invited to such a prestigious event. The invitation had come after a series of successful negotiations between the Empire and Earth. But standing here now, Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing against him. Despite his impressive credentials, Marcus had always been an outsider. Earth, with its relatively young spacefaring civilization, was often looked down upon by the older, more advanced species in the galaxy. Still, Marcus had managed to carve out a reputation for himself as someone who could navigate the complicated politics of the galaxy, someone who was capable of brokering peace in the most unlikely of places. He had never imagined his first appearance in such a prestigious setting would be so isolating. As Marcus stood silently, his eyes taking in the beauty of the banquet hall, he couldn't help but feel a little out of his depth. The alien guests around him were clothed in elegant robes woven with iridescent threads, their skin shimmering in a variety of colors, with features that were both strange and mesmerizing. There were towering beings from the planet Arendor, with their silvery skin and long, graceful limbs, and sleek, feline-like figures from the world of Nixos. The food and drinks were beyond anything Marcus had ever tasted, but he hardly felt like enjoying them when his mind was preoccupied with the overwhelming feeling of being the only human in a sea of galactic royalty. He shifted uncomfortably as he noticed the way the guests looked at him, some with curiosity, others with open disdain. Though his position as Earth's envoy should have offered him a certain amount of respect, it seemed to do little to quell the undercurrent of tension that rippled through the room. His presence here was a reminder that Earth was still a fledgling power in the grand scheme of things, and many of these dignitaries viewed him with suspicion. The evening progressed in a blur of formal introductions, speeches, and polite exchanges, but Marcus remained largely ignored by the royal circle. It wasn't until the Emperor of the Andromeda Empire, a towering figure draped in gold and purple, took the stage to deliver his opening address that the atmosphere shifted slightly. The Emperor's voice was deep and resonant as he spoke of alliances and the bright future ahead for the Empire. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the royal family's true intentions remained hidden behind their noble words. For a brief moment, Marcus's gaze wandered across the room, landing on the Princess of the Empire. She was seated at the head of the grand table, her regal presence commanding attention without her needing to speak. Princess Lyra, the Emperor's only daughter, was known across the galaxy not only for her beauty but also for her intellect and wisdom. Her golden hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall, and her violet eyes seemed to see straight through him as they met his gaze across the room. The princess was stunning, but it was her piercing gaze that left a lasting impression on Marcus. It was the kind of gaze that made him feel as if she could read his every thought, his every fear. The princess had been groomed for this role her entire life, and her mere presence was enough to make anyone in the room feel insignificant by comparison. Yet, it wasn't just her beauty that captivated Marcus. It was her calm, composed demeanor. Unlike many of the other aristocrats in the room, she exuded an aura of confidence and quiet power, as though she were above the petty politics of the Empire. Marcus's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of a bell ringing, signaling the beginning of the banquet. The Emperor and his family rose from their seats, leading the guests to the lavish dining tables that stretched across the hall. The food was laid out in extravagant displays, with delicacies from every corner of the galaxy. But Marcus didn't feel hungry. He had never been one for luxury, and tonight he found himself more focused on the intricacies of the royal dynamics unfolding around him. As the guests moved toward the tables, Marcus stood still, unsure of where to go. The table assigned to him was on the far side of the room, and as he glanced around, he realized that there was no one else seated near him. He was, for all intents and purposes, alone. The other dignitaries had already found their places, chatting and laughing with one another, leaving Marcus standing awkwardly by himself. He felt the sting of isolation more keenly now, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. Everyone else had their place, except him. He was the only one left standing. No one seemed to notice his predicament, or, if they did not care. A sense of frustration began to build in Marcus's chest. He had come all this way, worked tirelessly for months to earn his place here, and yet it felt as though he had been forgotten in the grand scheme of things. He glanced again at the royal table, where the princess sat at the center, her face unreadable, as she surveyed the scene before her. It was then that something unexpected happened. From across the room, Princess Lyra's gaze locked onto his once more. This time, however, something in her expression shifted. It was subtle, just the faintest narrowing of her eyes. But to Marcus, it felt like the world had suddenly come to a standstill. The princess stood from her seat, causing a wave of murmurs to ripple through the crowd. The guests looked on in shock as she moved purposefully toward Marcus. For a moment, Marcus was frozen, unsure of what was happening. Was she coming toward him? Why? The whispers of the guests grew louder, and Marcus could feel the eyes of the entire room on him. The princess, one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, was walking toward him, leaving her esteemed position at the royal table behind. As she approached, the room seemed to quiet. The princess, with her graceful movements, came to a stop in front of Marcus, her violet eyes meeting his.
"You," she said, her voice soft but commanding.
"Come with me." Marcus blinked, stunned. Was this a joke? A test? A trap? He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. The room had gone entirely silent. The princess did not wait for him to respond. With a steady, confident hand, she motioned for him to follow her.
"Sit beside me," she instructed. For a brief moment, Marcus stood there in shock.
The guests around him were watching with wide eyes, some of them speechless, while others appeared to be seething with disbelief. How could she possibly have chosen him, an outsider, a mere human, to sit beside her? But the princess remained calm, unwavering. She turned, leading the way back to the royal table, and Marcus, still in a daze, followed her. The tension in the room was palpable, but there was nothing Marcus could do except follow. As he took his seat beside the princess, the weight of the moment settled over him. It was as if the universe itself had paused and all eyes were on him. His heart raced, and a knot formed in his stomach. What had just happened? Why had she chosen him? The princess, for her part, said nothing more. She simply sat down beside him, her posture regal and composed, as if the entire room had not just witnessed an unprecedented moment in galactic politics. Marcus couldn't help but glance around, his eyes meeting the stunned expressions of the other guests. For the first time in the evening, he felt a strange sense of power, not from his position as a diplomat, but from the unexpected alliance he had just formed with the princess of the Andromeda Empire. The banquet had taken a turn, and Marcus was left wondering what would come next. The whispers that had filled the room before had grown silent now, replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. The guests, once chatting with ease, now sat in an awkward silence, their eyes fixed on the human who sat beside the princess. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. Marcus could feel the weight of the stares upon him, each one more intense than the last. Despite the elegance of the banquet and the splendor surrounding him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just been thrust into a situation far beyond his understanding. The princess had chosen him, a human. Of all the distinguished beings in the room, it was he who had been called to sit beside her. Marcus felt the intensity of the moment, like every gaze in the hall was piercing through him. The other dignitaries who had once looked at him with indifference were now watching him with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. He couldn't escape their eyes, even if he wanted to. He forced himself to focus on the princess, trying to ignore the murmurs that rippled through the crowd. She sat beside him, her posture regal and calm, as if she were completely at ease in this extraordinary situation. Her presence was commanding, and yet there was a subtle gentleness to her demeanor. Her violet eyes met his for a moment, and Marcus felt a flicker of something. Was it curiosity, or perhaps something deeper? He couldn't tell, but he couldn't help but wonder why she had chosen him. "Why me?" he finally asked, his voice quiet, though there was a tremor of uncertainty in his tone. He couldn't keep the question inside any longer. It had been swirling in his mind ever since she had called him to sit beside her. Why, out of all the other guests, had she chosen him? The princess turned her head slightly, her eyes softening as she regarded him. "Because you're different," she said simply, her voice calm, yet there was something in her words that sent a shiver down Marcus's spine. Marcus blinked, not entirely sure what to make of her answer. Different? He had spent his life on Earth struggling to prove that humans were capable of more than just survival in space. He had always been seen as an outsider, a species still trying to find its place among the stars. So, what did she mean by different? Before Marcus could ask more, a servant arrived at the table, bearing a silver platter filled with exotic fruits and delicacies from across the galaxy. The meal was exquisite, unlike anything Marcus had ever seen before. The colors of the food seemed to shimmer under the soft lights, each dish more beautiful than the last. But Marcus wasn't hungry. Not yet. His mind was too occupied with the princess's words. "Eat!" the princess said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "You must be hungry." "Don't mind them," she nodded toward the other guests, who were still eyeing Marcus as if he were some sort of rare specimen. "They will get used to you." Marcus glanced over at the other dignitaries who had now returned to their meals, though there was still an air of tension hanging over the room. They had settled back into their conversations, but every now and then, their eyes would flicker toward him. It was clear that his presence here was causing waves in a room that was meant to be harmonious. He nodded politely at the princess, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. As he reached for a piece of fruit, the texture was unlike anything he had tasted before. It was sweet, but with a hint of spice, and the juice burst in his mouth like a burst of flavor from a distant world. He hadn't realized how much he had missed the taste of new experiences until now. The princess, for her part, seemed completely unbothered by the attention. She ate delicately, her movements measured and graceful. It was clear that she had grown up in the public eye, used to the weight of expectation that came with her position. Yet, despite the opulence of the banquet and the grandeur of her surroundings, there was a certain loneliness that Marcus couldn't help but sense around her. It was subtle, but it was there, just behind the perfect smile, the poised demeanor. "I'm honored by your invitation," Marcus said, his voice breaking the silence between them again. "But I still don't understand why I'm here. Why choose me to sit beside you?" The princess didn't immediately respond. "That day I was—" Instead, she took a sip from her glass of sparkling wine, her fingers delicate around the stem. "You're more than just a diplomat, Marcus," she said, her gaze flickering toward him, as if she were considering her words carefully. "I see in you something that many of the others here lack, something that Earth itself has, even if it doesn't know it yet." Marcus frowned, still trying to process her words. What did she mean? He had always been told that Earth was still learning, still finding its place among the stars. What could he possibly have that would impress someone of the princess's stature? Before he could ask more, a low murmur spread through the room, followed by a heavy silence. Marcus looked up instinctively, his eyes following the princess's gaze as she turned toward the end of the hall. A tall, imposing figure had entered the room. One of the Empire's military commanders, a man known for his sharp temper and political ambitions. His arrival caused a stir, and Marcus could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The princess's expression remained unchanged, but there was a subtle tension in her posture. It was as if the arrival of the commander had changed something in the air. Marcus watched as the commander made his way toward them, his steps confident, though the crowd seemed to part with a slight reluctance as he approached. He was an intimidating figure, with broad shoulders and a chiseled jaw, his dark eyes scanning the room like a predator. When he reached the royal table, he paused, bowing low to the princess. "Your Highness," he said with a tone of formality that didn't quite hide the underlying challenge in his voice. The princess inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, though there was no warmth in her gesture. "Commander Varen," she said coolly, "I trust you have been well." "Of course, Your Highness," Varen replied smoothly, though there was an edge to his words. "It is a pleasure to see you once again." Marcus couldn't help but notice the tension between them. The commander's words were polite, but his gaze lingered on the princess longer than necessary, and there was something unsettling in the way he looked at her.
"You have the seat at the head of the table, Commander,"
the princess said evenly, gesturing to the empty chair across from Marcus. "Please, take your place." "A most intriguing choice of company, Your Highness," he remarked, his tone carefully neutral. The princess's gaze didn't falter as she met his eyes. "It is not your place to question my decisions, Commander," she replied, her voice firm. "Take your seat." The commander's jaw tightened, but he didn't protest further. He moved to the chair and sat down, but his eyes never fully left Marcus. It was as if he was measuring the human, trying to figure out what role Marcus had in this delicate game of politics. Marcus shifted in his seat, feeling the growing tension between the princess and the commander. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something much larger than he had anticipated. There was a web of political intrigue surrounding the princess, and now he found himself tangled in it, seated at the very center. As the banquet continued, the atmosphere remained thick with unspoken challenges and quiet power struggles. Marcus tried his best to remain composed, though he couldn't help but feel out of place. The princess's presence beside him was a constant reminder that he was no longer just a diplomat. He was part of something much bigger, something he didn't yet fully understand. The conversation around the table shifted as the commander and other dignitaries spoke of matters of galactic importance, military strategies, trade agreements, and the shifting alliances between the different factions. But through it all, Marcus couldn't help but notice how the princess remained calm, her thoughts hidden behind a veil of quiet elegance. She listened carefully, offering insight only when necessary, but it was clear to Marcus that she was always several steps ahead of everyone in the room.
As the evening wore on, Marcus's mind raced.
He had been chosen to sit beside the princess for a reason. But what was that reason? And why did she seem to trust him, a mere human, with such a position? What was the purpose of his presence at this banquet, and how would it change the course of his life? For now, all he could do was sit in silence, listening, watching, and waiting for the answers to reveal themselves.